The air in the boardroom was cold enough to freeze blood. I watched my brother, Julian, slide a sleek navy folder across the glass table. The sound of it skidding was like a blade sharpening. My father didn't look at me. He stared at his own reflection in the polished surface, his hands trembling as he reached for a silver pen. I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. Julian didn't say a word, but I noticed the pulse jumping in the side of his neck, a rapid, rhythmic thrum of adrenaline. Behind him, two security guards I'd never seen before stepped away from the door, moving closer to my chair. I opened the folder, and my stomach dropped. There it was, my signature on a document giving away everything I had built. But it was too perfect. Every loop and slant was a carbon copy of my digital ID. I realized then that the signature was a forgery, and my own family had drafted it. "This meeting is over, Adrian," Julian said, his voice flat and rehearsed. Before I could even speak, the security guards were flanking me. They didn't use force, but the threat was there in the way they stood. I was escorted out of the building I'd spent 5 years designing, past the employees who wouldn't meet my eye. In the elevator, I pulled out my phone to call our legal counsel, but the screen flashed a red warning. Access denied. I tried my banking app. Frozen. Simultaneously, every digital tether I had to the world was severed. Just as the doors opened to the lobby, a text arrived from my mother. It was short and chilling. "Don't fight this, Adrian. For the sake of the family name, just go." I stood on the sidewalk, a billionaire on paper and a ghost in reality. I had been made expendable by the people who shared my DNA. That evening, I drove to the family estate, hoping for a shred of sanity. I parked at the end of the long gravel driveway, hidden by the shadows of the oak trees. The house was glowing with warm amber light, and the sound of laughter echoed from the dining room windows. I stood in the dark, feeling like a stranger watching a movie of my own life. I crept closer, the grass damp under my shoes, until I was beneath the open library window. Julian's voice drifted out, loud and arrogant. "He won't sue," he told my father. "Adrian is too proud for a public mess. He needs us more than he needs the money. By next month, he'll be back begging for a consultant role." My father's response was a low, tired mumble of agreement. They had planned this for months, betting on my silence. I turned away, the laughter ringing in my ears. By morning, the narrative had already been set. I sat in a small coffee shop, watching the news ticker on a wall-mounted TV. Adrian Black steps down amid internal investigation into reckless conduct. The story painted me as unstable, a liability to the family firm's upcoming merger. My phone buzzed with notifications, not from family, but from former colleagues and friends distancing themselves from the fallout. I drafted a long, angry email to my father, pouring out my heart about the betrayal and the forgery. My finger hovered over the send button for 10 minutes. Then I deleted it. I realized then that words were useless against people who had already decided I was a villain. Instead, I went into my cloud backup and saved one specific file. It was a voicemail my father had left me weeks ago. At the time, it seemed normal. Now, it was the only weapon I had.
I ended up on a friend's pull-out couch in a cramped apartment on the edge of the city. The humming of the streetlights and the distant sound of sirens were a far cry from the soundproofed walls of my penthouse. I lay there staring at the cracked ceiling, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I pulled out my laptop and listened to the saved voicemail for the 100th time. It was my father, his voice cold and professional, instructing a legal team on how to handle the transition. He sounded like a man ordering a steak, not a father disinheriting his son. Then I noticed the date metadata on the file. The recording was time-stamped 3 days after the date on the forged will. My father was discussing the transition as a future event when the documents claimed it had already happened. I wasn't just betrayed. I had found the hole in their perfect lie. A week later, Julian called. He didn't apologize. He spoke with a condescending, smiling tone that made my skin crawl. "Look, Adrian, I know you're struggling. I'm willing to offer you a hardship allowance, $10,000 a month, on the condition that you sign a non-disclosure agreement and move out of the state." It was a humiliating offer, a drop of water for a man he'd left in the desert. I felt the anger rising, but I forced my voice to stay calm and polite. "I appreciate the thought, Julian," I said, playing the part of the broken man. He emailed the agreement immediately. As I scrolled through the fine print, I noticed a tiny discrepancy in a line item regarding shell company transfers. It was a mistake Julian assumed I was too emotional to read. He thought I was blinded by my pain, but he had forgotten that I was the one who designed the firm's audit systems. I needed more data, so I risked a trip to a quiet park where my father's longtime assistant, Elena, walked her dog. When she saw me, her face went pale, and her hands began to shake so hard she dropped the leash. "I can't talk to you, Adrian," she whispered, looking around as if Julian was hiding in the bushes. "I have a family to think about." I didn't push her. I just stood there, looking at the woman who had known me since I was a boy. Without a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. "I accidentally kept this," she said, her voice trembling. "It was on your father's desk the night they changed things." She handed it to me and walked away quickly. Inside was a list of shell entities and bank codes that I recognized instantly. They weren't just stealing my inheritance, they were bleeding the entire firm dry. I took the notebook to a small windowless coffee shop and met with Marcus, an old compliance consultant I had worked with years ago. He was a man who lived in the world of numbers and black and white truths. I laid out the ledgers and the shell company codes without saying a word. Marcus put on his glasses, his eyes darting across the pages. The silence between us stretched for minutes. Finally, he looked up, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of pity in his eyes. "Adrian, if you push this into the light, you won't just get your money back. You'll trigger a regulatory chain reaction that will melt the entire firm down." He leaned in closer, his voice a low warning. "Your brother didn't just forge a will, he built a trap. But if you pull the right string, they'll destroy themselves before they even see you coming." 2 weeks later, I attended a major charity gala. I wasn't on the guest list, but I knew the service entrances of the museum better than the security team did. I stood in the shadows of a marble pillar, wearing a tuxedo I'd bought with my last bit of cash, watching Julian. He was at the center of the room, basking in the attention of the city's elite, laughing and clinking glasses. He looked powerful, untouchable, and completely blinded by his own vanity. As I watched them, I realized Julian's entire empire relied on a single unprotected assumption that I was too weak to fight back. He was so busy looking at his own reflection that he didn't see the shadow moving toward the stage.
I spent the next month rebuilding my life in total secrecy. I needed capital, but I couldn't use my name. I approached a boutique lender specializing in high-risk tech investments. I presented a risk assessment model I'd developed in my spare time, a system that could predict market shifts with terrifying accuracy. The lead lender, a sharp woman with graying hair, studied the model for a long time. She didn't ask for my ID or my history. She just looked at the math. "This is the most sophisticated model I've seen in a decade," she said, looking up at me. "You're the one who built the Black Group's risk model, aren't you?" I didn't lie. I just nodded. She didn't care about the scandal or the news reports. She saw the value in the brain, not the name. She approved a multi-million-dollar credit line on the spot. I was back in the game, and nobody knew. While I was building my private fund, a massive audit request landed on Julian's desk. It didn't come from me. It came from the Office of Financial Regulation. Years ago, I had helped the government streamline their audit systems as a pro bono project. I knew exactly which red flags their automated systems looked for. I had quietly submitted an anonymous tip about the shell entities Elena had given me. The timing was too perfect to be an accident. Julian thought he was dealing with a standard review, but I had pointed the regulators exactly where the rot was deepest. I watched from a distance as the firm's stock began to jitter. Julian was an expert at PR, but he was a novice at forensic accounting.
He was trying to hide an elephant in a room full of glass walls, and the first cracks were starting to appear. I began reaching out to our international partners, the ones Julian had alienated with his arrogance. These were people who had known my father for decades and had only stayed because they trusted my leadership. I called them one by one from an unlisted number. I didn't ask for favors. I simply reminded them of the respect and transparency we had once shared. I told them a storm was coming and that I was building a safe harbor. The response was overwhelming. "We remember who treated us like partners and who treated us like tools," one CEO told me. By the end of the week, I had 3 major contracts lined up for a firm that didn't even have an office yet. I asked them one simple question: "Are you ready to come back to a company built on truth?" Their silence was the only answer I needed. Suddenly, my father called. He invited me to the house for closure. He sounded defeated, his voice a mere shadow of the man who had disowned me. When I arrived, the estate felt smaller, the grand hallways feeling more like a prison than a home. We sat in his study, the room where he had taught me how to read balance sheets. There were documents spread across his mahogany desk, sworn testimonies and bank statements that Julian had prepared for the audit. My father pushed a check toward me, a large sum that felt like a bribe for my continued silence. As he spoke about family unity, my eyes drifted to the papers on his desk. I noticed a set of dates that directly contradicted the testimony Julian had given to the regulators the day before. My father was holding the evidence of Julian's perjury, and he didn't even realize it. I left the house without taking the check. I didn't need to leak anything. The system I had built was doing the work for me. The compliance flags I had triggered were now glowing bright red in the regulators' offices. In the boardroom, Julian was growing increasingly defensive. He started firing long-term staff, convinced there was a mole in the building. He didn't realize that the mole wasn't a person, but the very math he had tried to manipulate. Shareholders began to panic as the stock price dipped below the merger threshold. They requested an emergency review of the firm's leadership. Julian tried to use his old tricks, shouting, threats, and gaslighting, but for the first time, no one was intimidated. The board of directors realized that the unstable brother might have been the only thing keeping the lights on. The tension peaked at a public industry summit. Julian was on a panel, trying to project confidence to a room full of investors. He saw me sitting in the back row, and for a moment his mask slipped. He tried to use charm instead of his usual aggression, even mentioning my contributions to the firm's early success. It was a desperate move, a late-hour attempt to bring me back into the fold before the audit went public. He approached me afterwards, smelling of expensive scotch and sweat. "Adrian, let's end this. We can fix the documents. You can have your seat back." I looked him in the eye and saw the fear he was trying so hard to hide. I didn't say a word. I just turned and walked away. The next morning, the board of directors officially scheduled a full forensic audit of every transaction Julian had signed.
I sat at the far end of the long table as a guest of the regulators, watching the screens light up with the very software I had designed. Julian sat opposite me, interrupting the lead auditor every few minutes with loud, hollow excuses. He looked like a man trying to stop a flood with his bare hands. The data was relentless. Every shell company, every forged transfer, and every hidden debt was being mapped out in high definition. Then the lead auditor paused. She pulled up the document from Chapter 1, the forged will and the transfer of authority. "Mr. Black," she said, looking directly at Julian, "we have a discrepancy regarding the digital signature on this authorization. It doesn't match the biometric logs of the timestamp." Julian's face turned a sickly shade of gray. The silence in the room was deafening. Julian looked around at the board members, his eyes wide and frantic. Under the crushing pressure of the evidence, his prestige mask finally shattered. He didn't take responsibility. He did what narcissists always do. He looked for someone to blame. It was Adrian.
he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "He set this up to frame me. He's been bitter since the day he was let go." He began to contradict his own prior statements, claiming he had never seen the documents he had personally filed. The board members exchanged looks of pure disgust. The room didn't turn toward me for a response. They turned toward our father, who was sitting at the head of the table, his head buried in his hands. The man who had stayed silent for the sake of the family name was finally forced to face the truth. I stood up and pulled out my phone. "I don't need to argue with my brother," I said quietly. "I'll let my father's own words finish this." I played the saved voicemail from Chapter 5. The room listened as my father's cold, calculated voice discussed the forgery as a future plan. It was the final, undeniable proof of the conspiracy. There was no anger in my voice, just the weight of the evidence. When the recording finished, my father didn't look up. He looked broken. Julian tried to speak, but the words died in his throat as he realized he had been caught in a trap of his own making. The board chair stood up and called for an immediate recess. 2 security guards entered the room, but this time they weren't there for me. They stood behind Julian as the chair contacted the authorities. The fallout was public, but it was bloodless. The press releases went out within the hour. There were no dramatic arrests in the lobby, just a series of quiet resignations and a massive corporate restructuring. The stocks began to stabilize almost immediately as the market realized the rot had been removed. The company was reorganized under the very framework I had built years ago, the one Julian had tried to destroy. I sat in a small office near the docks, watching the news reports of Julian's legal troubles and my father's early retirement. The board reached out to me that evening, offering me my old seat back and even the chairman's position. They spoke about legacy and restoring the name. I listened to them, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to belong to their world.
I declined the offer for full reinstatement. I took a small advisory role to ensure the employees were protected, and then I exited the family firm for good. I didn't need their mahogany tables or their glass walls to feel valuable. Months later, I stood in my own office, a minimal, quiet space in a repurposed warehouse overlooking the water. It was honest. It was mine. The city outside felt different now. The noise didn't sound like a threat anymore. I didn't have to give any rehearsed speeches or maintain a debt of silence to protect a lie. I looked at the rusted storage key sitting on my desk, a reminder of the man I used to be. I had reclaimed my value not by winning their game, but by choosing to play a different one. I finally had what no check could ever buy: peace. If you've ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours, you're not alone. Drop a comment and let me know where you're from. And if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe so we can meet here again.